Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
On behalf of the Cornwall Library, I'd like to welcome you to Cornwall Reads Cornwall, a library program now in its 6th year. We're grateful to the head of the Library Program Committee, Ann Coffin, as well as Roxana Robinson and Jane Bevins for organizing this year's event. Special thanks to Margaret Haskey, Director of the Library. Also thanks to the town of Cornwall and Gordon Ridgway for the use of this lovely historic town hall. I am Charlotte Van Doren, a longtime Cornwall gardener and the devoted shepherd of the Cornwall Garden Club. Thank you for joining us today as we enjoy readings from some of our favorite Cornwall writers through the years. We'll hear of garden toils and trials, triumphs and defeats, and see that Cornwall gardeners of the past had similar challenges that we have today. I first came to Cornwall in the early spring of 1988 on my second date with Adam, who coaxed me to drive 2 hours and 15 minutes north to a small town in the northwest corner of Connecticut. What I found on Bradford Road was an old white wooden farmhouse set amongst meadows, garden beds, stands of lilacs, and a place to grow vegetables and berries. This cultivated landscape was harmoniously surrounded and entwined with natural features of tall grasses and wildflowers, towering rocks, towering maples, and a roaring brook, and a wild forest. Against the old stone walls, his grandmother Dorothy's garden had new signs of plant life popping up along its edges. The effect was simple, unpretentious, and beautiful, expressing a harmony I'm more associated with painting or poetry. To me, that garden's respectful relationship to nature touches upon the essence of Cornwall and what attracts so many gardeners to this place. Cornwall remains a low-key country town that encourages open thinking, creativity, and a generous spirit. These attributes are essential characteristics of a successful gardener, and they are nurtured here. Here we are artists and poets of the garden. While I am a sometime resident of New York City, where I have a successful business in residential real estate and enjoy our urban life, my heart is here in Cornwall, in my garden, where I spend most of my weekend and summer days. Gardening during COVID, I dreamt about finding a way to bring all of Cornwall's erstwhile gardeners together. The incredible response to a simple email inquiry to some friends was the seed that started the Cornwall Garden Club. Bringing neighbors together to share the experience of gardening is one of the most satisfying things I've ever done. We are a town of gardeners. There are those of us with voluminous garden ambitions and others with a couple pots of geraniums blooming on a porch, but we share a common need to be outside with dirt on our hands and on our knees. How lucky are we to have such a magic union of interests and a special place to come together to share all the wisdom of flowers and weeds, birds and butterflies. I'm happy to introduce Kate Green, who will do our first reading. Kate is a former actress. She's also a doctor's wife, mother of 3 grown sons and 2 grandchildren. She's a teacher of crafts, a longtime Bronx Children's Museum board member, jewelry designer, amateur architect, tennis fiend, and a gardener by default. She's been a Cornwall resident since 1986, when the Greens bought an old stone summer house in Yelping Hill. After many magical years there, the family outgrew the house and found another. And well, Kate will tell the rest. Kate will be reading from Lewis Gannett's book, Cream Hill.
Hi. You may be wondering, change this. All right, let's see if we do this first try. All right. You may be wondering why I was asked to read from this iconic Cornwall book, Cream Hill, Discoveries of a Weekend Countryman by Lewis Gannett. So iconic, it illustrates the Cornwall Reads Cornwall flyer. Well, that house there, on the cover of this book, published in 1949, the old Gannett place was, 62 years later, my house. Or, I should say, my former house before it was struck by lightning in April of 2015 and was not able to be saved. We are forever grateful to our fire department who were able to salvage some irreplaceable artifacts, and all the recognizable burned bits and pieces were key to our insurance reimbursement. With that money, we rebuilt the house, and because we loved the old one, we tried to make it look as close to the original as we could. Lewis Gannett, like us, came to Cornwall with his family as a respite from city summers. He was the daily book reviewer for the New York Herald Tribune, as well as our writer. Most of these pieces were originally published in the New Yorker and are Cornwall gems. Ruth Chrisman Gannett, Lewis's wife, was the artist who did the illustrations, like that, for the book. She was a woman of talent and, it seems, unlimited energy. Well before we ever dreamed we would someday own her house, we heard that Ruth had a flower garden on the roadside that was so famous, busloads of tourists would drive by to see it. This chapter takes place a little bit before that would have happened, as you will hear. All you Cornwall gardeners will appreciate Lewis Gannett as he dutifully complies with Ruth's gardening directives. Here are excerpts from Chapter 9 of Green Hill Discoveries of a Weekend Countryman by Lewis Gannett. Our house was tenant occupied for a quarter of a century before we took possession, and tenants don't plant many flowers. The great lilac bushes in the yard obviously dated back to Reed family days, and so, I suspect, did the flourishing bed of tawny daylilies that ran down the hill from the yard. I presume the bed of myrtle, which has been enlarging its glossy carpet in the open patch of woodland north of the house through all our years of occupancy, also dates back at least a half a century. If we inherited any other flowers from previous tenants, they were the hesitant star of Jerusalem, which blooms off and on below the front stone wall, and a rather shabby variety of bluebell, which makes itself at home all over the place. We weren't going to kill ourselves gardening. Just a vegetable garden the first year and a few ferns was our motto. But the flat stones about the water barrel outside the door, after the barrel had been removed and the water turned into the house, looked even shabbier than they had before. We decided it might be a good idea to plant some nasturtiums between the stones. When we went to Mr. Utzler's to buy some nasturtium seeds, we noticed a few other packets that looked interesting. That was the beginning, and there has never been an end. The nasturtiums and the marigolds and the sweet alyssums bloomed prettily about the time we were leaving to get the children back for school. It was obvious we hadn't planted early enough. It was also obvious that those flat stones laid about the dead well into which the water barrel had overflowed needed rearranging. That first summer, I had the assistance of a former national shot put champion. We cut rollers from dead chestnuts in the woods, and we rolled, we rolled, but of course Scotty did most of the work. Some of the largest flat slabs of rock from the hillock north of the house to the water barrel site. One of them we laid over the top of the dead well, and another we carefully placed in a spot from which I have ever since wanted to remove it. But without the aid of a shot put champion, that rock stays put. Scotty now lives in Texas. Out of this rock arranging grew two beds, one under the south windows against the house, hereinafter known as the house bed, and another separated from it by an unfortunately uneven walk of flat stones known as the well bed. That was what that packet of nasturtium seeds began. The house bed and the well bed changed shape every few years whenever Ruth, weeding a corner, decides it would look better just a little might extend it, and after making a thorough mess, calls on me to help remove just one stone. It is amazing how just one stone can grow and multiply. To the east, the land used to have no definition. The lawn, it became lawn merely through the constant mowing of its assorted varieties of field grasses, sloped down toward a superannuated orchard. One fine morning, my wife, gazing reflectively and imaginatively out of an east window, suggested that it might be nice to have a narrow strip of flower garden separating the trimmed lawn from the unkempt orchard grass. I thought it would be nice too, but I had no idea how long and how deep a bed she had in mind or to what it would lead. I think it was in our second year that the idea was born, and in the third year, the long bed took shape. In the intervening winter, my wife studied seed catalogs, and the next spring, when I was about to spade the vegetable garden, she mildly inquired where she should plant the 21 varieties of flower seeds she had purchased. So, before digging the long bed, I spaded up a sunny patch behind the woodshed for a seed bed. Add seed bed to our list of gardens. The long bed used to have a rear border of iris, but Ruth eventually decided that the iris blocked the downhill vista and dug out great hunks of it, casually suggesting that I find some other place to put them. The long bed is also her favorite larkspur garden, her favorite phlox bed, the preferred home for her brightest zinnias, as well as for ornamental poppies and butterfly weed. And at one end of it in July, it is a mass of scarlet bee balm haunted by hummingbirds. Seen from the porch, this hodgepodge was eminently satisfactory, but inevitably, anyone looking at it from the porch was moved to walk closer. In a more intimate view, it became obvious that while the ground was generally sloped downhill, at one point the slope was uneven. A little digging, my wife suggested, would even this off and improve the prospect. I did a little digging. My first impression was that the obtrusive hummock was a pile of clamshells. The old Reed family must have loved clams. Though Green Hill is 80 miles from the sea, clamshells form an important part of the subsoil, no matter in which direction from the house you dig. And they're still there. The slope behind the long bed, however, must have been the Reed's favorite clamshell dump. And to make the clamshells sleep quietly, they also dumped there broken side blades and knives, bits of old harness, bottles, tin cans, cracked horseshoes, and a variety of other antiques, which have revealed themselves to us across the years and are still revealing themselves, still there. I did not, at first, appreciate the depths of this archaeological deposit because I discovered that the real reason for the hummock behind the long bed was a ledge. The ledge had crannies, obviously adapted for rock gardening. Further probing revealed beneath the ledge a bit of precipice. That was the beginning of our rock garden, which has since become our greatest pride and our greatest woe. For the rock garden grew, and I fear is still growing. It had and has no clearly defined natural limits. It began as a ledge a few yards square, slipped downhill over the miniature precipice, crept out in both directions along the base of the long bed, leapt across to an obviously landscapable boulder, which turned out to be another bit of bedrock, and on to other boulders and ledges. In late April, May, and early June, it is a magnificent sight. In July and August, it becomes seedy, and in September, it is just another impossible chore. So, there you have the house bed, the well bed, the square bed, the seed bed, the long bed, and the rock garden. I have already referred to the fern bed against the east barn, the wild garden in the woodside patch below it, and of course the vegetable gardens, two of them, which since Ruth invaded the older vegetable garden with her zinnias and forced the corn into a new plantation. Some of the iris that Ruth dug up from the long bed I set in below the retaining wall in front of the house, where it could be seen from the road. Ruth liked it there so much that she decided to enlarge the bed and add to the vision of beauty for passers-by. That became the wall bed. And now that the highway has been relocated, leaving us a potential walled garden between the stone walls that hedge the old roadway, Ruth thinks it would be nice to garden that whole area and to plant climbing roses beyond the farther stone wall to clamber over it, and again, to delight the passersby. There is virtually no limit to Ruth's creative imagination. Thank you.
Wow, that was really great, Kate. Thank you. I'm going to introduce to you Rob Lacy. Rob Lacy worked at a big law firm in Manhattan until 2014 and then went back to school and got an MA in philosophy from Columbia. He and his wife Karen bought their house in Cornwall in 2002 and completed a gradual transition from weekenders to full-time residents in 2021. He has served in the past as the treasurer of the Cornwall Village Improvement Society and a trustee of the library, and is currently the president of the Cornwall Conservation Trust, the Cornwall Foundation, and the Coltsfoot Valley Association. He spends as much time as he can working on a vegetable garden and small orchard, and shares the produce with groundhogs, raccoon, and deer. Rob will be reading from Michael Pollan's book, Second Nature, about the philosophy of gardening.
Can you hear me if it stays here?
No.
Now can you hear me? Michael Pollan teaches English at Harvard and for many years was a professor of journalism at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. He has written 8 books, including 6 New York Times bestsellers, 3 of which were immediate #1 New York Times bestsellers. One of those books, entitled The Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of 4 Meals, received a number of awards, including the James Beard Award for Best Food Writing. His articles have appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, Mother Jones, Gourmet, Vogue, Travel and Leisure, Gardens Illustrated, The Nation, the New York Review of Books, and the New York Times Magazine, as well as many anthologies. In 1983, when Pollan was 28 years old and living on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, he and his wife, Judith Belzer, purchased a farmhouse and 5 acres in Cornwall, which they still own. Pollan's first book, Second Nature, appeared in 1991 and described how he learned to cultivate a vegetable garden there. I'm reading from chapter 4, Compost and Its Moral Imperatives. As you will see, Pollan is a particularly thoughtful gardener who is just as concerned with social history and moral philosophy as with producing flowers and vegetables. Soon after we bought this one-time dairy farm, and I started reading books about gardening, I began entertaining a fantasy about turning over a shovelful of earth somewhere on the property and finding a thick vein of composted cow manure. To judge from everything I'd read, a trove of this airy, cake-like, jet-black earth would do much more than ensure an impressive harvest. It would elevate me instantly to the rank of serious gardener. What I read about compost gave me my first inkling that gardening, which I had approached as more or less a secular pastime, is actually moral drama of a high order. Some gardeners, and even some garden writers, talk about compost as if it were fertilizer. But that is only part of the story, and it is somewhat misleading. It is true that compost contains most of the principal ingredients of fertilizer, but not in terribly impressive quantities. The real benefits of compost lies in what humus, its main constituent, does to the soil. Compost improves the soil structure. Compost increases the soil's water holding capacity. Compost teems with microorganisms which break down the organic matter in soil into the basic elements plants need. Because it is made of decaying vegetable matter, compost contains nearly every chemical plants need to grow, including such trace elements as boron, manganese, iron, copper, and zinc, which are not often found in commercial fertilizer. And yet, as important as these benefits are, they don't account for the halo of righteousness that has come to hover over compost and those who make it. To understand compost's mystery, one probably needs to know somewhat less about soil science than about the reasons Americans garden, which, to judge from the literature and my conversations with experienced gardeners, frequently have less to do with considerations of beauty than of virtue. Most of the credit for compost's exalted status must go to J.I. Rodale, the founding editor of Organic Gardening, who until his death in 1971 promoted the virtues of organic gardening with a zeal bordering on the messianic. As Eleanor Perenyi tells his story in Green Thought, Rodale was a latter-day Jeremiah, calling on Americans to follow him out of the agricultural wilderness. This is how Perenyi, who is ordinarily the most sober of garden writers, describes her own conversion. Rodale's bearded countenance glared forth from the editorial page like that of an Old Testament prophet, and his message was stamped on every page. Like all great messages, it was simple, and to those of us hearing it for the first time, a blinding revelation. Soil, he told us, isn't a substance to hold the plants up in order that they may be fed with artificial fertilizers. And we who treated it as such were violating the cycle of nature. We must give back what we took away. The way to give back what we had taken, to redeem our relationship with nature, was through compost. When Rodale first made his pitch, he was treated with the degree of respect that is usually accorded to prophets. He was generally regarded as a crank. When he keeled over and died during a taping of the Dick Cavett Show in 1971, the nation responded with a smirk. Johnny Carson told jokes about it for weeks. But as concern over pesticides and the environment deepened during the 1970s, Rodale's message won a wider hearing. Today, his is the conventional wisdom in home gardening, and his ideas have even made inroads in American agriculture. That Rodale should have founded a quasi-religious movement, and that the compost pile should have emerged as a status symbol among American gardeners, makes perfect sense when you consider the attitudes Americans have traditionally held toward the land. The apotheosis of compost is really just the latest act in a long-running morality play about the American people and the American land. In the garden writer's themes to compost, you can still hear echoes of Jefferson's agrarian ideal. This notion of the garden as a realization in miniature of the agrarian ideal seems to have first appeared in the 19th century, as Americans in large numbers began leaving the farm for the city. If Americans could no longer remain primarily a nation of farmers, at least town-dwelling Americans might, like gardening, cultivate some of the rural virtues. The man who has planted a garden feels that he has done something for the good of the world, wrote Charles Dudley Warner. Around the same time, Thoreau planted his bean field in Walden, not so much in order to grow beans that he might eat or sell, but so that he might harvest tropes about the human condition. Improving the soil improved the man. The hortatory rhetoric may sound foreign to us today, but what about the underlying assumptions? These, it seems to me, we share. No less than the 19th century transcendentalists and reformers, we look to the garden today as the source of moral instruction. They sought a way to preserve the Jeffersonian virtues even in the city. We seek a way to use nature without damaging it. In much the same way that the antebellum gardener became a proof of the agrarian ideal, we regard our own plots, hard by the compost pile, as models of ecological responsibility. Under both dispensations, gardening becomes, at least symbolically, an act of redemption. But back to compost. Eventually, I did find the buried treasure. I was digging around the barn one day last fall. I turned over a chunk of sod, and there it was, the blackest earth I'd ever seen. I was elated, but only momentarily, because by then I had read enough about compost to know that finding it didn't really count. For I now understood that if you wanted to perfect my garden, that if I wanted to perfect my gardening faith, I would have to begin my own compost pile, which I promptly did. I built a slatted box out of some scrap lumber. I found a shady spot for it, and after the first frost had finished off the warm weather plants, I piled the box high with blackened bean vines, squash leaves, zinnias, sunflower stalks, corn cobs, and a half-dozen club-sized zucchinis that had somehow eluded timely harvest. I topped off the pile with a shovelful of the compost I found in order to introduce the necessary microorganisms. I mixed it all up, hosed it down, and forgot about it. By the time I returned to the compost pile in April, I had read enough about American gardening to know that composting was a pretty silly fetish. It would never produce a beautiful perennial border, just a morally correct one. And wasn't that a little absurd? Well, I guess it is. But when I lifted off the undecayed layer of leaves on top and ran my hand through the crumbling, black, unexpectedly warm and sweet-smelling compost below, I felt like I'd accomplished something great. If fertility has a perfume, this surely was it. This heap of rotting vegetable matter looked more lovely to me than the tallest spike of the Lewis Delphinium. Right then I realized that, like it or not, I was an American gardener, likely to cultivate in the garden more virtue than beauty.
That was great. Thank you, Rob. Absolutely fantastic. Now I'm going to introduce Stephana Bottom. Stephana has been learning how to garden in her home here in Cornwall for over 20 years. It's been a steep learning curve as she grew up in the tropical Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. Percy, her garden expert mother-in-law from Ontario, was very helpful, generous, and instructive. This is something significant that Stephana has discovered as her gardening life continues to unfold. Gardeners, no matter how many books they've offered and intimidating they seem from afar, they all just love to share ideas, solve problems, and literally load you down with plants. Try this and try this. All this interaction has been a real highlight for her, a real highlight of her life in Cornwall and its generous garden community. Encouragement, inspiration, solid garden facts and plants from myriad folks, many of whom are probably sitting in this room. Stephana had a very fulfilling work life in the city. She sold English antiques for the English company Asprey, and then spent 15 plus years in the food and publishing worlds working for Mario Batali at his first restaurants, creating food stories for Martha, Oprah, Ina, Rachel, and every other magazine, book, or TV segment to do with food. Now, in addition to pulling weeds, transplanting plants, and hauling tip bags to the compost, she works at our food pantry, helps Charlotte run our Cornwall Garden Club, is very involved with our UCC church, and works for a nonprofit focused on children's hospitals in Southeast Asia. Stephana will read passages from Josephine Nuese's book, The Country Garden.
shout out to the book that was new to me that I read happily to prepare for this reading. It is available at our wonderful library, has at least 1 or 2 copies. The book was published in 1970 and was written, as Charlotte said, by Josephine Nuese. She wrote a weekly gardening column for the Lakeville Journal for many years in the 1960s. And she used these columns with a calendar type format going month by month to create this book. Each month of the year is a chapter full of relevant garden instructions, tips, and her own musings. Josephine very purposefully called her book The Country Garden, as she writes exclusively of her rural home garden here in Cornwall, with emphasis on our beautiful stone walls, very old trees, and our sharp, cold gardening zone. Ahead of her time, she often refers in the book to her love for and extensive use of native plants. Through the generosity of garden friends, I was able to see this home where Josephine lived with her family up on Johnson Road. There still exists part of her original garden, never enough, of course, but a beautiful tall stone wall near the house is there with original tree peonies and other plantings. This was part of her original upper terrace. Her daughter, Sally, is here tonight, who lives in Millbrook now, and she shared stories with me of her mother constantly gardening, making plans in January for what she'd do in May, drawing pictures of garden plans, filling the house with cut flowers, especially phlox and stock, and the sound of her mother's typewriter always in the background. Sally was enlisted to endlessly carry watering cans back and forth. So let's see what Josephine wrote. A time for dreaming. Anyone who thinks that gardening begins in the spring and ends in the fall is missing the best part of the whole year. For gardening begins in January, begins with a dream. Every garden worth the planting must begin with a dream. There is no other way of beginning a garden. Unless you are perfectly satisfied with the usual conventional plantings, the horticultural cliches, and if so, there is little sense in your going on with this book. Each January is a fresh start. You know that this year, at long last, your garden is going to be perfect. Cascades of never-ending bloom, each plant superbly placed and superbly grown. No weeds, no bugs, no bare spots, no mistakes. And of course, no maintenance. You leaf through the catalogs half drunk with anticipation. For this is the gardener's cocktail hour. And just as in the candlelit dusk of the cocktail hour, all men are brilliant and all women beautiful, so in the catalogs, all plants are enchanting. All bloom unceasingly. All are easy to grow. All are suited to your areas. It is one of the happiest of all delusions, putting stars into the eyes and mush into the mental process. It is also a time of danger to the novice in such matters, and I urge you to go slowly, to order only what you can handle wisely and well. If you are an experienced gardener, you already know your limitations, the limitations of your property, and you view the catalogs with a wary eye. Yet you cannot become an experienced gardener without first gaining experience. So why I go on about this is a mystery. Nobody ever pays any attention to such advice anyhow, which perhaps is just as well. How to visit a nursery. From late April on through May, you will probably be visiting all the nurseries in your area, searching for trees, shrubs, and perennials. This will be a happy time for you. And I beg of you to make it a happy time for the nurserymen also. An incredible number of normally courteous and considerate people displayed shocking carelessness and discourtesy, if not worse, when visiting a nursery. It must be that they simply do not realize the consequences of their thoughtless acts. First of all, try to remember that spring is the time of the ulcer for those who make a living from the sale of plants. It is the time when, within a few short weeks, hundreds of trees, shrubs, and evergreens must be carefully dug, carefully balled and burlapped, and moved into their display area. When thousands of baby perennials must be fed, cultivated, and or shifted into containers and moved into their own display area. It is the time when the weather can spring fatal surprises, the time when machinery breaks down, when the hired help either gets sick or decides to take an easier job. It is the time when nurserymen's wives have babies, and don't ask me why. Maybe you think of yourself as busy in the spring, but my friend, you are lying on a park bench with a newspaper over your face compared to a nurseryman. So, for the sake of all concerned, here are a few don'ts to keep in mind when visiting a nursery. Don't take dogs into a nursery, leave them in the car. A male dog will, with unerring taste, select the most valuable evergreens upon which to bestow his compliments. A female dog will choose a bed of choicest seedlings for similar attentions. Both, if intrigued by the scent of bone meal, are likely to start excavating, and the resultant root damage can be fatal to the plants involved. I have seen all these things happen and have had great trouble keeping my mouth shut. Of course, some nurseries have resident dogs, but you can be very sure that these animals have been well schooled in nursery behavior, which your dogs have not. 2, don't let small children run wild in a nursery. Long planted rows fascinate most children, and in their happy romping, countless plants are likely to be stepped on or broken. If the nurseryman seems a little grim while listening to sounds of childish glee from a distant area, it is because he has learned through bitter experience what he is likely to find there later. But he must operate on the popular fallacy that the customer is always right. So please, out of simple consideration for him, try to keep track of your lusty young. 3, don't pick the pretty flowers. It seems incredible that any thoughtful, well-mannered adult would do this, but I have seen otherwise charming people tear sizable branches from flowering trees and shrubs just because they were so pretty. If you ripped off part of a dress in a dress shop, the manager would certainly make you pay for the damage, and some nurseries have, in self-defense, adopted this policy. So don't get light-fingered about the plants. 4, don't insist upon seeing the owner or manager who may be desperately busy far afield, unless your problem is obviously beyond the abilities of the helper who is attending you. If a plant, which looks like a Fitzer juniper, is clearly labeled Fitzer juniper 750, you don't have to call a board meeting. Just pay the lad and have him put it in your car. However, if you have real landscaping or horticultural troubles, don't hesitate to ask for expert advice. Most nurseries are very happy to supply this. You may have to wait a little while for this expert to arrive from the far field, and you should be prepared to buy from him at least some of the materials he recommends. But the help and information you receive should make this well worth your while. Above all, do remember that a nurseryman's time is his most precious commodity in the spring of the year, so don't waste it on chit-chat. Like Garmey. What is that wonderful smell? Asked one of the guests, hopefully rattling the ice in an empty glass. We were all sitting out on the terrace in the dusk of a June evening, and that wonderful smell was sweet rocket. There was a planting of it nearby in the corner of the stone wall, rising whitely against the evergreens. It was an all-white garden designed especially for summer evenings. The gays, roaming around, found white blossoms everywhere, gleaming against the dark of the stone walls, the dark of evergreens. In one area, the first white spires of delphinium were rising up against stone. In another, a cascade of white clematis tumbled over the wall. In still another, there was the gentle splashing of water, and, tracked by ear, the eye found huge, white, lotus-type peony blossoms bending over a tiny pool. By the gate which gave entrance to this enchantment was the white blur of a fragrant, old-fashioned mock orange against the dark gray of the house. It was a blur because most of us were well past middle age and had our glasses off, which made everything look better. I couldn't wait to see it by daylight with my glasses on, see if it really was that good. Well, it was, even in daylight. The whole thing had been planned for summer only, from Memorial Day to Labor Day, so no space was wasted on early or late bloom. Except for white flowering quinces at either end of the delphinium planting, mostly for summer foliage, plus groups of white tulips here and there, and white lilacs planted outside the wall but bending over it. These items just for May weekends, hostess said. I asked how long it had taken to get this show on the road, to get all these plantings so skillfully blended. Hostess said thoughtfully, about 10 years of making mistakes. And she added, I'm still making them. I nodded respectfully. The gardener who can recognize mistakes is the gardener who has learned a lot.
Jane Garmey worked in public television for many years, was an audiobook producer, and is the author of Great British Cooking, A Well-Kept Secret, and 4 books about gardens and gardening. She's written about gardens, food, travel, and interior design for many publications, including New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and was for several years garden correspondent for Town and Country. She came to Cornwall in 1991, and ever since has spent a great deal of time getting dirt behind her fingernails. Jane will read her own work entitled The Perils and Pleasures of Gardening.
Necessity being the mother of invention. That's how I got hooked on gardens and gardening. It began many years ago when my husband and I bought, almost by mistake, but that's another story, a very rundown, tiny 18th century salt box in Falls Village. For months we were busy trying to match the chestnut floor planks, which turned out to be hemlock, repairing the crumbling foundation, and dismantling the knotty pine paneling so carefully installed by Doris Day. Yes, the Doris Day. She, it turned out, had bought the house when she was a Radio City Rockette before heading off to become a star in Los Angeles, and then sold it to a fellow Rockette who lived there until she died. We were so busy, I never gave much thought to the dismal, bumpy field around the house until one day my husband logged me up. What are we going to do about the yard? Well, like many of you in the audience, I was alert to that particular variation of the where's the butter question. It was the word yard that went completely over my head. In England, we have Scotland yards, station yards, children play in schoolyards. But even if it's the size of a handkerchief, paved in asphalt and fenced in with barbed wire, the land around a house is your garden. In America, I learned one starts with a yard and with money, sweat, and tears transforms it into a garden. Does this have something to do with the pioneering American spirit and the urge to conquer new frontiers? Certainly it seemed I was being asked to work some magic on this expanse of unkept grass and to make it into some kind of a garden. So, having decided to accept the challenge, that was when I began to garden, and when broken fingernails and aching bones became part of my lifestyle. My American friends steadfastly refused to believe that someone who grew up in the land of Gertrude Jekyll and Sissinghurst had not been born with a spade in one hand and a trowel in another. They thought I was joking when I had to admit I thought New Dawn was not a rose, but a dishwashing liquid. Again and again I had to explain I came from a family with no interest or expertise in gardening or gardens. As I began to find my garden feet, people assumed I knew the difference between a rugosa and a hybrid tea. I did not. I knew how to make a compost, but I hadn't a clue what compost was. And what did I think of Henry Kelsey and Betty Pratt, people I'd once met? My pleas of ignorance were interpreted as false modesty. For a long time, I felt like a remedial student who, through some bureaucratic mix-up, finds herself floundering in a graduate seminar. Part of my learning curve was finding out that gardening in the northwest corner presented some considerable challenges, absolutely unheard of in England. Winters where the temperature could sink to 15 degrees below, marauding deer, snapping turtles who decided to lay their eggs in my flower bed, bears, raccoons, woodchucks, possums, snow at the end of April, even frost in late May, and once hailstones the size of golf balls in mid-August. But as I dug into my patch of New England soil, I found I was getting hooked. I read voraciously, visited as many gardens as I could, and began to discover the depth and breadth and ins and outs of making a garden. Unlike interiors, which begin with a framework of walls and rooms, the outdoors has less constraints, and this means more challenges, more tough decisions, and many, many more mistakes. Trips to garden nurseries were the highlight of my gardening education. Oh, reason not the need, that line from King Lear became my mantra, but since I was completely undisciplined when it came to buying plants, and unfortunately had never had the good advice of Josephine Nuese to guide me, what could equal the pleasure of arriving home after a horticultural shopping spree and opening the back of the car to see that jumbled array? How could I possibly have bought so many of adorable newbies, eager, willing, and ready to join my garden party? Just as I was beginning to achieve the semblance of a small, manageable garden in Falls Village, we outgrew our tiny Doris Day salt box and realized we had to find something a little larger. By a piece of great good luck, ended up in Cornwall. Here again, there was no garden to speak of, just a yard with an unkempt and intimidating amount of unruly grass, punctuated by a few crumbling stone walls. 6 ancient maple trees shaded the house from the road, but otherwise the outdoors presented a dauntingly blank slate. The garden began to take shape when a friend who was replacing her old lawn and Burnham greenhouse sent it my way. Attaching it to one side of the house became the impetus for a small parterre garden edged in boxwood. Next came a flower bed in front of the stone walls, but I found soon that its length was too intimidating and divided it into 2 beds, thereby making a path into the space behind, which became another distinct garden room, home to 4 dwarf weeping cherry trees, unloaded on me by a friend who no longer wanted them. And these I placed symmetrically around the turn-of-the-century stone urn, alone from another friend who was moving away and was happily never reclaimed it. As you can see, friends have played a decisive role in how my garden has evolved. Early on, it took a chance visit by Master Gardener Robert Dash of Madhu fame to gently point out that a parterre, or even a parterre on even a small incline, doesn't work. Now this seems obvious, but then it was a revelation, and not a particularly welcome one, since it required bringing in an expensive yellow machine to level off the slope. However, the resourceful operator suggested using his remaining time to clear the mass of tangled brush growing between a small barn and a former chicken house. Eureka! The space was cleared and proved the perfect spot for a picking garden and the ideal site for an anti-gun fence, an impulse buy made some months earlier. A visit to the Alhambra convinced me I needed a rill, which in turn necessitated a row of hornbeams and a brick path, which meant that for the next 2 years I was on an endless search to find old bricks. And where no grass would grow in the shade of an enormous pine tree, I dug up bucketfuls of Petasites japonicus tubers from where else but a friend's garden. Yes, it is invasive and has to be fiercely reined in, but it does make a dramatic backdrop to my always growing birdhouse village. In spite of my best intentions, my Cornwall garden never gets finished. I love annuals, and each year end up with far more books than any sane person should have. Searching out antique garden ornaments never loses its appeal, and now I'm seriously thinking about a meadow of native wildflowers. On and on it goes. No end in sight. In spite of my mistakes, my dirty fingernails and aching bones, my garden still gives me enormous pleasure. I think often of the poet John Keats' unforgettable pronouncement that a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Yeah, that's true, but what he didn't say is that a garden is a job forever.
Incredible. And now I will introduce Roxana Robinson. Roxana Robinson is one of the local tribe of Roxanas, all of them Scovilles. The family has been here at least since 1762, when the then current Samuel Scoville was named as surveyor of highways. Roxana has been coming to Cornwall all her life. She's a gardener, tennis player, and writer, the author of 11 books, 10 works of fiction, and the biography of Georgia O'Keeffe. She's the former president of the Authors Guild, teaches in the Hunter College MFA program, and is a trustee of the Cornwall Library. She's also the proud owner of Katie, a standard poodle named after her grandmother, Catherine Scoville. Roxana writes for various publications, among them the Washington Post and the Cornwall Chronicle. Roxana will read her own work entitled Gardening in the Wilderness.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thanks to all of you for coming today. So that was important in 1762. The reason it was an important year was that when Samuel Scoville was named as an engineer. It was the year after Cornwall had decided to let pigs roam freely in the township. The year before they had let cows, but that year it was pigs, and that was a big moment for Cornwall. So be aware of that. My great-great-great-grandfather probably voted on that. So, gardening in the wilderness. My grandfather was Samuel Scoville Jr. Professionally, he was a lawyer, but privately, he was a nature writer. He loved birds, beasts, snakes, and plants, and he wrote about everything he came across in the wilderness. In the 1920s, Sam bought 15 acres of wilderness from his brother, William Scoville. Billy owned Mid Hills, the white farmhouse now belonging to the Prudhomes. Sam's piece was a long, densely wooded rectangle rising east from Town Street, up over the crest, and sloping all the way down to Cream Hill Lake. My grandparents, Sam and Katie, grandmother of my dog, hired Ruth Adams, the architect of Yelving Hill, to design their house, Treetop. Ruth Adams was a devotee of William Morris of the English arts and crafts movement. Adams liked to put her houses in dramatic settings with clear-cut, distant views. She was not big on gardens. Treetop is perched on top of a stone bluff that stands at the top of a long, open slope. Looking east towards the lake, there's hardly 4 feet of bare stone before the cliff. There's no chance for a garden there. Looking west was a wide stone ledge and a huge glacial erratic, which my grandmother named the Pebble. Except for a tiny scrap of lawn, the house was surrounded by woods. No chance for a garden there. 15 years ago, my husband Tony and I took over Treetop, and Tony thought, he didn't tell me at the time, but he told me later, it's too bad Roxana won't be able to have a garden here. And yet, we enlisted the help of a landscape designer, Patrick Chassé. He raised the ground in front of the house, so it stood on a level flat. This stretched westward towards Town Street, where he made a small ravine. Using local stone, he made terrace lawns and cleared more of that stone ledge. He had sculpted the landscape and changed it dramatically, but he would not design the garden. What am I going to plant here? I said. That's up to you, he said. I'm done. Designing the garden was a challenge. There was nowhere to start. There was no straight line from the drive to the house. There was no straight line from anywhere to anywhere. There was no axis, no symmetry, no geographical matrix as a foundation. The hillside was still steep, the stone ledge vast and bare, and the wilderness still pressed tightly against the little clearing. The critters were still prowling around us. In my grandparents' time, skunks and possums and raccoons had sidled onto the back porch where we kind of loved seeing them. And now, as you know, bears have joined them. It was not a domestic place. What sort of garden could I make? What sort of garden did I want? What is a garden in the wilderness? I decided to embrace the wild. I would harmonize, not fight, with the plants and the landscape. I would celebrate the wilderness. I would not impose straight lines. I would not insist on order. I would have rules, but they would not be based on convention. Rule 1. The perimeter that defined the garden would be entirely native. Instead of a stone wall or a high yew hedge, the edge would be made of loose stands of aruncus or tall calacanthus. Even if you didn't recognize them, you would sense that the plants in the garden were reaching out to their own in the woods. Rule 2. In the rest of the garden, I would tend toward natives. Rule 3. I would only use local stone or stone that harmonized with dark gray gneiss, which is spelled G-N-E-I-S-S, but disappointingly pronounced nice. Our Cornwall native. Gneiss is metamorphic, formed by heating other rocks to unimaginable levels and then stirring them like cake batter, leaving folds and seams and ripples in the cooled, solid form. I would celebrate the gneiss, dropped here by a glacier 30,000 years ago. Rule 4. The design would respond to, not argue with, what was there. From the driveway to the house, where there was no straight line, I put a long blue stone walk with a bend in it. At the bend, I set a tall gray stone Italian urn, which is reminiscent of those used by landscape designer Beatrix Farren. It comes from a place in Maine which uses Farren's designs, and they can be left out all winter, so it's a twofer. Beatrix Farren was a hero of Patrick's and mine, so I have brought both of them into my garden. On either side of the walk, there were two wildly disparate areas. To the south was a wide stretch of sloping ledge by the drive, and a flat patch of earth by the house. To the north was a steep ravine by the drive, and then flat lawn to the house. There was no way to unite them. I would celebrate their difference. By the stone urn, I planted a big, dense calacanthus, which was a hedge that would conceal what was beyond it. So you had to come around the urn before you could see the piece of land next to the house. The little flat plot beside the house, and this became a secret garden with a stone path and a bird bath. The colors there are cool pastels, jewel pink columbine, starry blue brunnera, creamy plumes of astilbe. The white clematis clambers up the column on the front porch. This little hidden border, with its pretty colors and very well-behaved residents, is named Sissinghurst. Rule 5, the stone ledge would dominate, and so everything there planted on it would be low, flat, and cool. Creeping thyme, native juniper, native potentilla, native sedum, everything on it defers to the vast, ancient presence of the gneiss. Rule 6, plants in the ravine are survivors. Anyone there has to have sharp elbows. The sides are steep and the bottom is rocky, and in a rainstorm, it's a creek. Along the bottom, sedges and water grasses appeared, their soft, narrow foliage suggesting water, even during a drought. So those were allowed to stay because they were speaking the name of the creek that appeared later. Rule 7, colors in the ravine are all hot. Evening primroses blanket the sides in butter yellow, and Crocosmia lucifer sends out scarlet starbursts across the ravine. Lobelia cardinalis, the cardinal flower, pops up wherever it chooses, and the giant orange Mexican sunflower, Tithonia, towers over everyone else. The chaotic ravine with its hot, bushy, aggressive inhabitants is named Margaritaville. Rule 8, critters. I had a million pollinator plants for bees and butterflies, hummingbirds and dragonflies and their friends. But I wanted frogs. Who doesn't? I sank a rubber feed bucket into the ground and filled it with water. Each spring I order azolla, an invasive, non-hardy, non-native that cannot escape from the bucket. Its tiny floating roots naturally filter the water and keep it clean, and its tiny leaves form a dense green mat which protects and hides the frogs. So all summer long I have a little froggy band on mosquito duty. If I had inherited a gentle open landscape and a white farmhouse, maybe I'd have made a rose garden hedged in box. But we take what we are given. I was given a tiny plot in the midst of a wilderness. Sissinghurst, Margaritaville, and the frog pond are what I made.
Thank you all, and thank you speakers for sharing some Cornwall garden wisdom with us. We welcome you to join us at the library for a reception following this event. Thank you very much.